Good evening, Windsor.
At 11:17 on a Thursday morning that began like any other, Prince William's phone rang. Not the usual calls. Not routine palace business. This was the tone reserved for emergencies, so rare they divide life into before and after. The moment he answered, the color drained from his face. Within seconds, his hands, normally steady, disciplined, began to tremble. Standing alone in his private office at Kensington Palace, winter light pouring through the windows that suddenly felt too harsh, Prince William received news so severe it seemed to press against the very walls. The call came from Sir Clive Alderton, King Charles's principal private secretary. A man known throughout the palace for unshakable composure, even during the monarchy's darkest hours. But today, his voice was different. Not panic, but close. "Sir," he said, the formality heavier than usual, "you need to return to Windsor immediately. There's been a development. A serious one." William didn't ask questions. The tone told him everything. Whatever had happened was beyond routine crisis management, beyond the constant turbulence of royal life. He ended the call, stood frozen for 3 full seconds, then moved with the focused urgency of someone trained his entire life for a moment he had always prayed would never come. He found Catherine in the nursery, helping Charlotte with schoolwork. She looked up and stopped mid-sentence. She recognized that expression instantly. She had seen it only once before, when his grandmother died. Without a word, she rose, excused herself from the children, and followed him into the hallway. "It's bad," William said quietly, his voice barely holding. "They won't explain over the phone. They've locked down communications." Catherine didn't ask questions. She simply reached for his arm and squeezed. Some moments demand silence, not answers. Within minutes, protection officers were briefed. A car waited in the courtyard, engine already running, prepared to make the 20-minute drive to Windsor in half that time. Across Kensington Palace, staff moved with practiced efficiency. But even they felt it. Something was wrong. One longtime housekeeper later said the chill that morning had nothing to do with the December cold. As William's car sped away, encrypted messages rippled through palace communications teams across London. Lockdown protocols activated. Media briefings postponed indefinitely. Senior staff recalled from leave. The crisis machinery, silent for months, roared back to life. At Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was heavier still. Corridors cleared. Doors sealed. Staff redirected without explanation. Princess Anne had arrived earlier, her face set in the expression reserved for the hardest moments. Queen Camilla remained inside the private apartments. Those who glimpsed her said she looked as though she had aged a decade overnight. But the most chilling sign wasn't what was happening. It was what wasn't. No statement. No health update. No reassuring words. Just silence. And in that silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had happened, whatever was coming next, would change everything. What made everything that followed so unsettling was how normal the morning had been. Almost offensively normal. Prince William woke at 6:30 a.m., as he always did, to the soft chime of his alarm and the faint sound of children moving down the hallway. Life, for a brief moment, felt ordinary. In the kitchen at Kensington Palace, he shared breakfast with Catherine and the children. George talked about his upcoming exams. Charlotte mentioned her piano recital. Louis spilled juice across the table. Charlotte complained about her maths homework. And George, as he did most mornings, asked, hopefully, if he could skip his French lesson. Ordinary. Beautifully ordinary. Heartbreakingly so. By 8:15, William was in his office reviewing the day's schedule with his private secretary. A veterans' charity meeting at 10. Lunch with advisors to discuss the upcoming Australia tour. Security briefings. Afternoon calls with constitutional experts over a minor Privy Council issue. Nothing unusual. Nothing urgent. Nothing that hinted this day would split his life cleanly into before and after. His secretary even joked about the light workload, suggesting, half smiling, that William might finish early enough to watch George's football practice at 4. William laughed. He welcomed the idea of normality, of being a father on the sidelines, not a prince carrying the weight of the crown. Then, at 9:30, something shifted. It was small, easy to miss, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the rhythms of royal life. A text message from Anne. Short, careful, unusual. Have you spoken with father this morning? William frowned at the screen. And didn't text. She called. Or spoke in person. Words mattered to her. Tone mattered. And this message felt measured, as if she were probing whether he knew something she couldn't yet say. He replied that he hadn't spoken to Charles since the previous evening. His father had seemed tired, but otherwise fine. Anne's response came almost immediately. Call me when you can. Privately. The unease began then. William called her at once. Voicemail. He tried again 10 minutes later. Then 15. Still voicemail. The polite recorded message felt wrong, inadequate, almost insulting in the face of the growing pressure in his chest. And always answered. Always. Her phone was an extension of duty, and Anne did not ignore duty, not without extraordinary reason. By now, the warmth of the office meant nothing. His fingers felt cold. His focus narrowed. That familiar tightening settled behind his ribs, the instinct he'd learned, over years, never to ignore. Catherine noticed. She appeared in the doorway just after 10, studying his face, the way his attention had folded inward. Everything all right? She asked quietly. William looked up from his phone. The screen was dark now, but it still seemed to demand his attention. Probably, he said. The word didn't convince either of them. I can't reach Anne, he added. That's strange. Catherine didn't dismiss it. She never did. After years together, she had learned to trust the moments when his instincts shifted, when something unseen had already begun moving. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, beyond the routines and schedules and spilled juice at breakfast, events were already accelerating. By midday, the ordinary would be gone, and nothing would feel safe again. After years of watching William navigate crises both public and private, Catherine knew one thing with certainty. When his instincts warned him something was wrong, they were almost never wrong. By 10:30, fragments began to surface. None of them made sense. None of them fit together. A member of William's equerry staff mentioned, almost casually, that the king's entire morning schedule had been wiped clean. All appointments cancelled. No explanation. No carefully worded justification about diplomatic reshuffling or routine adjustments. Staff preparing for an investiture ceremony had already laid out medals. Programs had been printed. Then, with barely an hour's notice, they were dismissed. No ceremony. No answers. Then came word that Camilla had cancelled her public appearance at a London hospital, citing a personal matter. That detail landed harder than the rest. Camilla did not cancel. Ever. Reliability was her quiet creed. Showing up, no matter the circumstance, was part of how she anchored the monarchy in public life. William tried calling his father directly. Not through aides. Not through intermediaries. The private number. The line rang 3 times before connecting, but it wasn't Charles who answered. It was his private secretary. Apologetic. Polite. Carefully controlled. His Majesty was in meetings and would return the call shortly. The words sounded rehearsed. Not informative. Deflective. William ended the call more unsettled than before. The unease had hardened now, crystallizing into something colder. Dread. At 11 o'clock, he was meant to be across town, shaking hands at a veterans meeting, listening to stories of service and sacrifice. Instead, he sat motionless at his desk, staring at his phone, waiting for someone, anyone, to call and say this was all a misunderstanding. No call came. Catherine brought him tea, setting it down beside papers he hadn't looked at in 20 minutes. "William," she said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder, "whatever it is, we'll handle it." He nodded. But the words rang hollow. Some things couldn't be handled. Only endured. Then, at 11:17, his phone rang. That tone. The one reserved for emergencies so severe they bypassed every normal protocol. The one that announced disaster before a single word was spoken. William answered on the first ring. Sir Clive Alderton's voice came through, tight, urgent, stripped of its usual steadiness. The words he spoke would replay in William's mind for years. The moment time fractured. The truth had arrived. The drive to Windsor felt endless, despite the speed. His protection officer pushed far beyond normal limits, empty motorway lanes treated as if they existed solely for this moment. William sat rigid in the back seat, staring through tinted windows as winter fields blurred into streaks of gray and brown. No one spoke. Thomas, his lead protection officer for 8 years, knew better. He had seen William through security threats, family loss, public storms. This silence was different. It demanded respect. As the car passed through Windsor's gates, the change was immediate. The grounds felt wrong. Staff stood clustered in doorways instead of moving through their routines. Security had been doubled, perhaps tripled. Officers stationed at every entrance. The main doors, usually alive with the quiet machinery of a working palace, were sealed. Cordoned off. Less like governance, more like preparation. William wasn't taken to the staterooms. He was led to a private wing, one reserved for family matters so sensitive they could not risk being overheard, and was waiting in the corridor outside the king's private rooms. Her face told him everything, and was waiting outside the study. She stood perfectly still, arms crossed, posture rigid, in a way that somehow conveyed more tension than pacing ever could. Her face was grave, but composed, shaped by decades of being the steady presence in moments when everything else threatened to fracture. When she saw William approaching, something shifted in her expression. Not sympathy, recognition. She knew what he was about to hear, and she knew it would change him. "How bad?" William asked quietly, and didn't hesitate. She never softened the truth. "Worse than we thought possible." Inside the study, the air felt wrong. Cold. Sterile. Heavy. Charles sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, though no fire burned despite the December chill pooling in the corners of the room. Camilla stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder, protective, almost desperate, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, as if tears had already been spent elsewhere. On the desk lay the evidence. Medical reports on official letterhead, legal documents bearing government seals, and a single handwritten letter in Charles's familiar script, his fountain pen placed neatly beside it, as if order might soften the blow. Sir Clive Alderton stood near the window alongside the king's senior physician and 2 constitutional advisers William recognized instantly, men who had already absorbed the news and now waited to watch someone else endure it. William stepped into the room slowly. Every instinct warned him that what awaited would be worse than anything his imagination had conjured during the drive. Charles looked up, and in that moment, William saw it. His father looked smaller, diminished, as though the weight of the truth had hollowed him from the inside. "William," Charles said, his voice rough, worn thin. "Sit down, please." William didn't. Staying upright felt like the only way to keep control over a situation already slipping beyond it. "Just tell me," he said, more sharply than he intended. The physician stepped forward, holding a file that seemed impossibly thin. Too ordinary to contain catastrophe. But catastrophe, William was learning, rarely arrives loudly. It comes in manila folders, in quiet rooms. The doctor spoke first in clinical terms, medicine's careful language acting as a brief shield. Advanced progression, unexpected complications, treatment options exhausted, timelines significantly shortened. The words floated, technical and precise, circling a truth they refused to name outright. William cut through them. How long? The physician glanced toward Sir Clive, a silent exchange William recognized instantly. Weeks, the doctor said carefully. Perhaps months, if we're fortunate. But not years. The room tilted. William gripped the back of a nearby chair as the weight of the news pressed down on his chest, his shoulders, his breath. His father. The king who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown. Who had only just begun the reign he had prepared for his entire life. And now, everything that followed would be measured against this moment. The king, who had spent decades preparing for the role he had finally achieved, was dying. Not in some distant, abstract future that could be postponed or ignored. Soon. Irreversibly. Devastatingly soon. Charles spoke then, his voice carrying an unexpected calm, the sound of someone who had already passed through shock and arrived at acceptance. I've known for 3 days, he said quietly. I needed time to understand it myself before telling anyone else. He paused. I'm sorry you had to wait for the truth. William felt the flicker of anger rise, at the delay, at the loneliness his father had endured, at the cruelty of carrying this knowledge alone. But it dissolved the moment he looked at him. The exhaustion, the resignation, the slight tremor in his hands. Anger felt misplaced, almost disrespectful. Does anyone else know? William asked, his voice sounding distant even to himself. And Camilla, the medical team, constitutional advisors who needed to begin preparations. Charles held his gaze. And now you, he added softly, because what comes next will fall to you far sooner than any of us imagined. The hours that followed unfolded strangely. Time stretched and collapsed in uneven fragments, some moments unbearably long, others disappearing altogether. William stayed at Windsor, unable to imagine what leaving would mean when the life he knew no longer existed. Normal had evaporated. Catherine arrived early that afternoon. The children were kept at Kensington Palace, sheltered, for now, from the truth that would soon redefine their world. She found William in a small sitting room, staring at nothing, lost in a way she had never seen before. She sat beside him without speaking. Some grief does not need words. After a long silence, William finally whispered, I'm not ready. 3 words. Barely audible. I'm not ready to be king, he said. Not like this. Not now. Not when it means losing him. Catherine took his hand, tracing small circles across his knuckles. No one is ever ready, she said gently. But you will do it anyway. Because it's who you are. Because you're his son. She squeezed his hand. And you won't do it alone. Not for a single moment. By afternoon, Windsor Castle had transformed into a command center. A crisis that could not yet be acknowledged publicly demanded absolute precision behind closed doors. Constitutional experts gathered in secure rooms, reviewing succession protocols untouched since 1952. Dust was blown from documents meant to remain hypothetical for decades longer. Regency frameworks. Emergency transfers of authority. Procedures written for another era. Plans that assumed William would be older, more experienced, more ready. Princess and moved through it all with unflinching clarity. She coordinated with the Prime Minister's office through encrypted channels, ensuring the machinery of government would not falter. She reviewed security with military advisors, knowing vulnerability invites danger and that tragedy creates opportunity for enemies. And she made the hardest calls of all, to family members across Britain and Europe, delivering news that rippled outward like shockwaves. Camilla stayed closest to Charles. Her world narrowed to the man whose time was now measured not in years, but in days. Staff noticed she barely left his side, eating when he could not, sitting beside him when he slept, reading aloud as if presence alone could hold back the inevitable. She had fought decades to stand beside him as queen, and now that role was being taken almost as soon as she had stepped into it. For William, the hardest part remained the children. How do you tell them their grandfather, the man who made them laugh, told stories, played games, is dying? George, old enough to understand permanence. Charlotte, sensitive enough to feel everything. Louis, too young to fully comprehend, and heartbreakingly unaware of what he would lose. They chose to wait, to find words for the unsayable. By evening, exhaustion settled over the castle like fog. William stood at a window, watching darkness swallow the grounds, and joined him, standing silently before speaking. You're thinking about everything you'll never get to ask him, she said. Not a question. William nodded. There's so much I still needed to learn, he said quietly. About being king. About surviving this life without losing yourself. He turned to her, not as the future monarch, but as a son. He waited his whole life for this, William said. It isn't fair. And didn't argue. Some truths don't need correction. That isn't fair. And didn't hesitate. Fairness has nothing to do with monarchy, she said flatly. It never has. The words were blunt, almost cruel, but William needed them. Then her voice softened, just enough to reveal what she rarely allowed herself to show. But you're right, she added. He deserved more time. We all did. And I'm sorry you're being asked to face this now. The following morning brought fresh crises layered atop the devastation. William was summoned to an emergency meeting in a secure conference room where constitutional advisors, legal experts, and senior palace officials had been working through the night. Their exhaustion was visible. Their urgency unmistakable. Sir Clive Alderton opened without ceremony. Your Royal Highness, we need immediate decisions regarding succession procedures and public announcement protocols. These are choices only you and His Majesty can authorize. William sat at the head of the table. The position felt premature and inevitable. What are the options? He asked, his voice steady, his hands clenched beneath the table. The constitutional secretary, 4 decades in service to the crown, spoke next. The first question is timing. When do we inform the public? She slid a document toward him. Option 1. Immediate announcement. Full transparency. The advantage is honesty. The risk is panic. Markets, diplomacy, national stability. Option 2. Gradual disclosure. General health concerns first. Updates over time. It allows adjustment, but risks accusations of deception. Option 3. Minimal disclosure until absolutely necessary. Privacy for the family, but a breach of public trust. William stared at the pages. Each option felt like a different kind of failure. What does my father want? He asked quietly. And answered. He wants to protect you from making this decision. But that's no longer possible. The military secretary added softly, there are security implications. Once this becomes public, threat levels rise. Succession always brings instability. William exhaled. I need to speak to my father, he said. Before anything is decided. Charles was in his study when William entered, papers spread before him, still working. Even now. It was so perfectly, heartbreakingly him that William had to pause in the doorway. "They've given you impossible choices," Charles said with a tired smile. "Sit. Let's speak as father and son, not king and heir." What followed would stay with William forever. Charles spoke of regrets, of unfinished work, of the strange cruelty of finally reaching the role he had waited a lifetime for, only to have it taken almost immediately. But most of all, he spoke about William, about pride, about trust, about certainty. "I want you to announce it," Charles said finally. "Not immediately, but soon. Within the week." He held his son's gaze. "The public deserves the truth, and I deserve to spend what time I have left without pretending." Then, firmer, "And you deserve time to prepare, to step into this with dignity, not chaos." William's voice broke. "I don't know if I can do this." Charles reached across the desk, taking his hand. "You can. You will. Because you're my son. And because you were born for this, even though neither of us wanted it so soon." When William returned to the conference room, his decision was made. They would announce within 3 days. The announcement came on a gray Monday morning. At exactly 8 a.m., Buckingham Palace released a statement that stopped the world. "His Majesty has been informed by his medical team that his condition has progressed more rapidly than anticipated. Treatment options have been exhausted." The language was restrained, dignified, unavoidable. The impact was anything but. Markets stalled. Broadcasts were interrupted. Social media flooded with shock and grief. Across Britain, people gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor, not to protest, but to stand together. A reign that had taken a lifetime to begin was already ending. Inside Kensington Palace, William and Catherine faced the hardest moment of all. They told the children that evening. George understood immediately, turning away to hide his tears. Charlotte cried openly, asking questions no one could answer. Louis, sensing the sorrow, climbed silently into Catherine's lap and stayed there. At Windsor, Charles watched tributes pour in, world leaders, citizens, strangers. Living through one's own legacy was surreal and unexpectedly moving. Anne threw herself into logistics. When urged to rest, she replied simply, "There will be time for grief later. Right now, there is work." And William changed. In the weeks that followed, the weight became visible. His posture, his silences, the way he carried himself. The future he'd avoided contemplating was now immediate. Yet amid grief, there were moments of grace. Long conversations between father and son. Quiet afternoons with Camilla. Video calls with the children. Stories, laughter, fading strength. As December edged toward Christmas, the monarchy existed in suspended time. Everyone knew what was coming. One night, Catherine found William standing at a window, snow falling over Kensington Gardens. She joined him, said nothing, took his hand. And in that silence, William understood what kingship truly meant. Not the crown, not the ceremony, but standing in darkness, carrying impossible weight, and choosing to move forward anyway. The crown does not wait for readiness. It does not pause for grief. It simply passes. And William stands now at the threshold, between what was and what must be, carrying his father's legacy into a future neither of them wanted, but both must face.